Hey, I hope you guys are doing good today. We are going to be watching the food nobody wanted, and it's sourdough bread. This is from a new channel that I had discovered. It's called Townsends, and it looks like it's really interesting. Very American history based type channel. So I thought this would be kind of fun, especially for maybe some of our non-American viewers or American viewers that maybe don't know a whole lot about American history and like colonial times, stuff like that. I think this would be kind of cool. If you do get a chance, I'd appreciate if you can leave a like and subscribe. It helps me out a bunch. And I will have Townsend's video link in my description below. So be sure to go and like their videos, watch their videos. They're pretty educational and pretty cool to watch. I think they've been really, really interesting to me. So give them a subscribe. But all right, let's see about the history of sourdough bread. All right, before we get started, are you a fan of sourdough bread? Do you make your own bread? Let me know in the comments. I am a big fan of sourdough bread. I have never made my own bread, and that is something that I do want to do one day. I do have a bread maker that we've never used. So I would actually love to make myself some bread. I feel like I'm gonna be very busy come fall time with all this food history and recipes and everything. It's like I have this just huge list of stuff that I wanna make that seems like it's all cozy food, so but let me know, do you make bread?
When I say sourdough, the first thing that probably comes to mind are internet videos on TikTok or YouTube of people that are teaching you how to make sourdough. They're explaining to you what live cultures are, and they're probably even pulling a jar out of their refrigerator and they're saying, hey, look at this. And it's this goopy, watery, smelly mess. They feed their starter and they have a regiment about it, and they're so excited about it. You go to a restaurant, they bring this beautifully crusty sourdough bread out to you that kind of has a little off taste. And some people, I'd say even 20 years ago, probably weren't really excited about that, but we are now.
I do know that there are a lot of people that don't like sour bread too, and I don't understand no. I get it. Like, if everybody has a different taste, and that's totally okay. I also love that all these videos, they dress in, like, colonial times, and all their settings are like this, and it looks so cozy, and they all have, like, very relaxing voices, and I don't I just I love the whole vibe of this channel.
We look forward to that. Sourdough is huge
It
right
looks
now, but in the
delicious.
18th century, the time period that we make these videos about, people were not excited about sourdough. Generally, some people, French, maybe, but English people, American people, sourdough was not exciting to them. I know somebody,
I get excited for sourdough, how could we not? I'm a fan, I'm a big fan.
but English people, American people, sourdough was not exciting to them. I know somebody who has a sourdough starter that is 130 years old, and they're so excited about it.
Oh
And when
my
I hear
god.
that and I start thinking about sourdough, it makes me think this is a time honored tradition, and people have loved this since the beginning of the very first time they accidentally made sourdough. And I don't think that that's really the case. In fact, in the 18th century, they were making bread, and bread was so popular. We've covered it so much on the channel that it was even regulated by law. So bread is
It was even regulated? Holy moly. Yeah, I think that's how you know you got a hit, right? When the government gets involved, you know you made something popular. Although this bread looks like it's so good. I would love a loaf of this.
popular. We've covered it so much on the channel that it was even regulated by law. So bread is such a part of their day, and they care so much about it that sourdough was kind of an afterthought. It wasn't something that people were excited about. They were excited about nice, fresh bread made from the baker using yeast from the brewer. So if it wasn't sought after in the
Oh.
time period, then why even make it? That's the question, right? And we have to look at sourdough for what it is, not necessarily what we think that it is. They weren't using it in the same way that we are at all. In fact, they didn't have a refrigerator or someplace nice and cool to keep a sourdough starter. So it's completely
Oh, that's a really good point. Yeah, so like how did this become so popular? I always forget about that for some reason. I always forget about refrigeration in certain times where I realize that it wasn't a thing, but for some reason, that, like, notion always just kind of leaves me, and then they're like, "Oh, yeah, they didn't have refrigeration," and I'm like, "Oh, well, like, that makes everything makes sense."
Have a refrigerator or someplace nice and cool to keep a sourdough starter. So it's completely flipped on its head, and sourdough is made out of necessity in the time period. If you didn't live in a place where you could just go to the brewer to get some yeast or go to the baker to get your bread, well, then where did yeast come from? And that's the question. That's
Ah.
the whole thing about sourdough is what's going on with yeast, what's going on with live cultures, and what's that doing in our bread? The relationship between the brewer and the baker was essential in the time period, especially if you were living in a community.
That makes a lot of sense because, both of these 2 can work together, and it's like nothing gets wasted, so all of this seems like it's very important for towns or villages or whatever, to kind of, thrive.
And the baker was essential in the time period, especially if you were living in a community. They worked together hand in hand. The baker's best friend was the brewer because that's where he got barm. This is
Yeah.
barm. So this is what is scraped off of a fresh batch of beer, and that is where the yeast for the bread came from. So the baker would go over to the brewer and say, "Hey, I need some barm. I got some baking to do." He gets his barm, he goes back, and this is how he is getting yeast into everything that he's baking for that day. So the question is, where do you get yeast if nobody's brewing beer? And that's the problem because the folks in the 18th century, they needed bread. They wanted
Yeah.
bread. And there are lots of ways that you can make
I feel like bread's important. I feel like bread is very, very important even now. I'm a big fan of bread.
bread. They needed bread. They wanted bread. And there are lots of ways that you can make bread without leavening, without the bread rising, right? We covered ash cakes and we've covered all sorts of things on the channel where you have bread, but it's not the bread that's sought after. It's not this light, fluffy structure loaf of bread that they want. So how do you create that if you don't have the brewer to go take some barm from every morning? If you lived in a community of people, this wasn't a problem at all for you. Beer and bread were essential parts of the diet for folks in the 18th century. But say you were a sailor and you were going to be away for a long time, or you're traveling through the frontier and you're going somewhere away from a community, or times where it got so cold that yeast was a problem, they couldn't keep it alive. There were different instances where people had to lean on another way to make bread, and that's what we're going to talk about right now with this recipe. This recipe comes from Plows and Politics by Carl Raymond Woodward, and it's called an experienced
Clouds and politics, I love that. Where did all these, like, cool, like, cooking cookbook names and book names how come I feel like we don't have those anymore? Like, they're not as, like, catchy like that, you know?
This recipe comes from Plows and Politics by Carl Raymond Woodward, and it's called an experienced wreck to make yeast. Boil 1 quart of wheat bran in a gallon or 3 quarts of water. Strain it and let it stand to be cold as milk from the cow. Then put in some rye flour, which is best, so as to make it as thick as yeast usually is. At the same time, put in half a spoonful of ginger and 1 gill of molasses. Stir it well together. Set it where it will be warm till it rises, which is known by its foaming and bubbling, which will be from 2 to 8 hours according to the season.
Oh,
As
wow.
soon as it rises, set it in a cold place, but not where it will freeze, which would spoil it. It will keep in a cool place 3 or 4 days. Use it in somewhat large quantity than yeast. A pint will rise 4 large loaves.
Okay. So this is an interesting, very, very interesting recipe. This kind of makes me think of I don't know about other people in America, depending on where you lived or whatever, but I know when I was in like elementary school, um, we got to go to like these colonial towns, and it was all set up for like I guess, educational purposes. So you would go and they'd have all kinds of things, like people making leather, a butcher, a baker, all kinds of stuff. And everybody um, would be dressed, in colonial times. And then you kind of had these like stations, I guess you'd go to, and you got to learn about how everybody did their job or like did their part at during that time. This is what it kind of makes me think of, and it like kind of gives me good memories though, because I really enjoy doing that. What this like, the way this man talks and just how he describes things and everything, it just gives me kind of like that like core memory of like going to these colonial town things because we would do it like probably like every year like when I was in elementary school we got to go and do this and I do remember those because I thought it was really cool. It was like one of the really cool things that I was lucky enough to be able to experience.
What we know now is that yeast is all around us. It's in the air. And we have different bacteria that is in our atmosphere, and that is what we're working with when we're working with sourdough. They didn't understand that science yet, but they knew something was happening. So they're boiling this wheat bran and they're going to set that out with some flour and they're going to let something happen to it. They don't really quite understand what's happening like we do today. But it's still a very similar process. You're going to mix together grain and water and set that out and let the atmosphere do its work. The first thing we notice in this recipe that we think now, man, that's strange, is that they're boiling this bran. We wouldn't boil this today because we're going to say, if you boil it, then you're killing what's already on the wheat bran, and we don't want to do that. They didn't quite understand that then. I'm not sure if they were trying to create a sterile sort of environment or really what was going on there.
It's so cool to see how much we've progressed. Like this is just food related stuff, right? So like even just like technology aside, like this is purely just, cooking every day, just normal kitchen stuff. And it's so cool to see how far we've come.
And I'm not sure if they were trying to create a sterile sort of environment or really what was going on there. If you've got an idea, let me know in the comments section. One of the problems that we often have while we're trying to decipher 18th century recipes is that we don't get all of the measurements for everything, and that's pretty much across the board. So it gave
That makes a lot of sense though. Yeah, because I forget, I think it was tasting history, like how like measurements didn't like standard measurements didn't come around for a while. So I would imagine trying to replicate 18th century recipes is probably really hard, or there's like a lot of trial and error maybe.
don't get all of the measurements for everything, and that's pretty much across the board. So it gave us how much water to use, right? And it gave us how much molasses to use, and it gave us how much ginger to use. It did not give us how much flour to use. It says to make it as thick as yeast usually is. So are they talking about this, where this is the barm that they get from the brewer and it should be really loose? Or are they talking about something that we would might be called like a sponge, where we're wanting to make this into like a thicker, goopier kind of paste and let it rise?
Oh.
Well, the truth is that I have tried this both ways, and both ways have worked for me. I like the idea of keeping it a little bit looser, so that's what we're doing in this video. And you're still probably thinking, this doesn't seem like sourdough. Just wait, we're gonna get there. For our recipe here on making yeast, we don't need nearly as much as the recipe called for, so I cut it in half. I used 1 pint of wheat bran, and I used about 2 quarts of water. You're gonna boil that. Once it boils, you're gonna remove it from heat, and you're gonna strain it and let it cool. Then you are going to add flour, the molasses, and the ginger, and then we're just gonna let that sit. Now, I will say that this says 2 to 8 hours, but it will likely take much longer than that. All right, so for our actual bread, we're gonna create a really simple bread recipe here. We're gonna take about 1.5 cups of rye flour. We're gonna take maybe 3 cups of all-purpose flour or wheat flour, whatever you have. We're gonna add some salt, and then we're
I wonder if he's like really, really good at eyeballing stuff. I feel like he is. I feel like I get that. Like he's been doing this probably for so long and is so into history like this that I bet he's really, really good at like eyeballing things. I am not. I am terrible. I do the best I can sometimes, but uh when comes to baking, I feel like I would absolutely have to be measuring stuff out. But I feel like he's like a pro eyeballer measurement type of guy.
of all-purpose flour or wheat flour, whatever you have. We're gonna add some salt, and then we're gonna add about 1 cup of this mixture that we have, and then probably another cup or so of warm water just to make that paste the right consistency. Okay, so we've got our dough ball here. This is our loaf of bread. We're gonna set it aside in a minute to let it rise, but this is the really interesting part about sourdough in the time period. We're gonna take off a piece, and this is where sourdough starts to come into play, right? So this is called leaven in the time period, and leaven means old dough. And what we're gonna do with this is we're gonna store this back, and this is going to be what we use to make our next loaf of bread. And the way that they did
Oh.
that was it was just going to be for a couple of days or maybe the next day. They would pack this in flour to help give it a kind of a short-term preservation. If you're going to hold it off for several days to a week or something like that, you're going to coat it in salt, and then we're even going to bury it in the salt
Oh, wow.
so that it preserves. They didn't have a refrigerator. They didn't have a way to keep this, perfectly preserved. So they had to harden it. And so the cultures are going to stay alive inside of this, but it's going to get a crust on the outside that's going to be preserved. And the next time we're going to go make bread, we're going to scrape off as much of the salt as we can. We're going to chop this hard bit of dough up into as many fibrous pieces as possible. We're going to add water and stir that together, and it's going to create our new yeast for our new loaf of bread. And
That's actually really genius. That's actually really, really smart for this time period that they figured out that they could preserve so much stuff in salt. I know during this time, I think a lot of meat and a lot of things were preserved in salt, but the fact that they figured this out, like this is cool. This is like really, really cool knowledge to know or history, I guess. I feel like this is really interesting.
stir that together, and it's going to create our new yeast for our new loaf of bread. And every time we do that, we're going to pull off a piece, we're going to preserve it in the same fashion, and that is how this becomes sourdough bread. Our dough has risen, our loaf is ready to bake. We set this
Ooh,
aside for about an
looks
hour,
good.
and here we go. It looks really great. I'm excited to see what it's going to come out like. We're going to get into a Dutch oven right now. Researching sourdough bread in the 18th century is very difficult. They didn't have terms like sourdough, and you can't search for things like live cultures. They don't quite understand what's happening with all those things. You
Oh yeah, I bet the research for some things is probably extremely difficult to navigate through of trying to uh almost like interpret, certain ways that are being described in certain foods or whatever to know that like, oh, like maybe this is salt or this is preserved or it's this or it's that. Like, gosh, these guys must be very, very smart.
can't search for things like live cultures. They don't quite understand what's happening with all those things.
Oh,
You
that looks good.
eventually come across leaven, and then you think, okay, well, leaven is just leavening bread. But in the time period, they referred to leaven as this old dough that they were storing back to be able to create bread in the future. So, old dough method or leaven is really what you arrive at when you're looking for sourdough. And it's funny because I think a lot of times today we think of sourdough bread as this old method of cooking. And not to say that it isn't, it was just done in a different way. It was called something different, and it wasn't extremely sought after. Like I said earlier,
Isn't that so crazy how stuff that like really wasn't popular or great or considered good is, like I feel like there's a lot of foods like that today that they have like weird histories of like, oh yeah, like everybody hated this or it's like or like only poor people ate this or whatever, and now they either like have like the total opposite of that or they're super popular and everybody loves it. It's kind of cool to see timelines like this. I really like watching food history stuff like this. It goes to show like how much stuff changes over time, how much we've learned, and just the whole progression of how much better we got at understanding food and cooking and like how you can combine certain things and make something incredible and it's just I think it's just all really cool and food brings everybody together so that's even better.
way it was called something different, and it wasn't extremely sought after. Like I said earlier, there were some cultures that really liked the taste that they're getting from sourdough bread or old dough method leaven bread, but it wasn't necessarily what they wanted in England. And depending on where you're at and what's in the atmosphere around you, different strands of this bread are going to taste different over time, which is
Oh
really
yeah,
interesting about it. And it's the same today.
that is cool too. I didn't even think about that either, that you can have different strands and it's gonna make your bread taste a little bit different. So, like one place isn't gonna be the same. It's not like, I think everybody knows what like wheat bread tastes like or white bread or whatever, like this one could be having kind of very different tones to it depending on the strand that's in it. That's actually kind of cool. Because then you could kind of almost be super unique with yours.
of this bread are going to taste different over time, which is really interesting about it. And it's the same today. So this is a loaf of bread made in the fashion of the time period with yeast that is from the atmosphere and then didn't come from the brewer. Now, it's
That's
got a good bit
cool.
of rye flour in there, and it's got some ginger, it's got some molasses. I don't expect to actually be able to identify the ginger. I think the molasses might come through just a little bit, but for the most part, this is going to taste like a loaf of rye bread. In the future, after you
Ooh,
use the
yeah.
leaven from this over and over and over again, that's where the sourdough is going to come into play. But let's see what this tastes like.
That's such an interesting, like, I guess, way that we got to sourdough bread too. So it's gonna taste more like rye bread, which I love rye bread too. So, I mean, like, let's be honest, I like all bread. So, but rye bread is really good. But it's interesting that it's like a whole process of what got us to the rye bread or the sourdough part.
Over again, that's where the sourdough is going to come into play. But let's see what this tastes like.
Delicious. It was good.
Well, this is really, really good rye bread. That's what it tastes like. We've got our sourdough, we got the leaven that we held back, and that's going to turn into something different. That's where that sourdough taste is going to come from in the future. Right now, it's just a fantastic bread that anybody would be happy to eat. In the future, it's going to be a little bit more interesting.
That's so cool. This was such an interesting video. I mean, I had no idea about how sourdough came about. I mean, in all honesty, I feel like it's just been around. I feel like it's just one of those things that I feel like sourdough has just been something that's just been around, and I never even thought about where it came from or how it came into existence or anything like that. I definitely probably took that for granted of like it's just always been here. So this was great. I really love this. I love the whole vibe of these videos, and I loved how he talks about his research and he's gonna make this like in 18th century style and all the explanations and all the history that we got from it. I love this channel. This is great. I'm gonna probably gonna be watching some more of this because there's definitely a lot about American history that I still like do not understand. I would say food is definitely a category that I know very, very, very little about when it comes to like even like this, for instance. Like I had no idea about how sourdough worked here, or that it like wasn't liked by everybody. So this is a great channel. Loved it. Thank you so much for hanging out with me. I really appreciate you guys being here. Be sure to go and like and subscribe to Townsend. They have some really, really cool videos on there. And if you are interested, I guess more in about like American history and food and stuff, I feel like this is a really, really good channel for that. So I do recommend them. But that's going to do it for me. I hope you guys had a great day, and I will see you in the next one.